So good afternoon again, everybody. Welcome to our Anglo American Migrant Leaders webinar on preparing for interviews. We're really privileged to have Salima Shariff and Scott Haber join us from Anglo American, and they're going to lead the session. I shall hand over to Salima now. They can introduce themselves when they are on, and I'll sit back and deal with any chat. Any questions, I'll chair the questions and coordinate the questions as they come up. So over to you, Salima. Thanks very much.
Fozia, thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who've joined us today and those of you who'll be watching it later on the recorded version. So thank you, especially you guys who've joined today. I don't know where you are. It is very warm where I am. And quite frankly, if I wasn't here, I'd be outside trying to get some sun or probably getting out of the shade, getting out of it in some way. So thank you very much. So my colleague and I, Scott, and I'll introduce Scott in a second, will be spending the next 45 minutes, 50 minutes talking you through around how to prepare for interviews. Interviews come in various guises in all organizations. If you are at school, it might be an interview that you do have to do for your college or for your university. If you're at university, it will be maybe for your internships or even for getting a job. So interview skills are just one of those key skills that I think everybody should have. Please use the chat. The more questions you ask, the more interactive it will be. We will every so often stop to ask particular questions. So if you're shy and you don't want to come off mute, please just put it in the chat. We're very happy to answer those questions. And what Scott and I will be talking you through today is very much built upon our experience and background as well. Trust me, there are a million different ways in which you can prepare for interviews. There's some core items, and if you ask any recruiter, any HR professional, they'll also give you a very different perspective as well. So this is our view and our opinion. That's why I actively encourage you to ask questions, because you've got me, you've got Scott, and I'm sure Fozia will also share some of her experiences as well. So I want to introduce Scott. Scott and I have been working together, some might say for far too long, but it's a great time. We have been, the universe conspired for us to work together, and Scott has a lot of experience. So Scott, a quick introduction from yourself.
Thank you so much, Salima. And yeah, it's not too long yet. So I'm Scott Haber. It's lovely to meet you. I've been with Anglo for about 3.5 years, but I've been in the recruitment industry for about 25 years. I've kind of stopped counting at about 25 years. And yeah, it's a pleasure to meet with you guys that are with us today, and shout out to those guys that will be watching later.
Wonderful. So I'm going to quickly just do the quick screen share, and I'm hoping. Brilliant. Thank you very much. It's always a bit tricky when you put the screens up. So we're going to be covering through a couple of items with you all today. So there's two parts of what we're going to be covering today. First one is very much a crash course in how to prepare for an interview, and Scott will be leading that. And every so often I'll be sort of jumping in also to share some of my thoughts and opinions. And the second part, or the latter half, is about once you've secured the role, probably when you're going into your first graduate program, or it could even be your summer placement, it could be anything, how you might want to negotiate your first salary. So we'll talk a little bit about how you negotiate and the mantra, money is not everything. So Scott, I think first question we're going to ask everybody, please use the chat here, guys. 2 questions. Do you know how to prepare for an interview? 1 being no way, 10, of course I do. And how comfortable would you be to negotiate your salary or your package? 1, no way, 10, very comfortable. This just gives us a little bit of a feel around how experienced you are today, but also gives us a little bit of a feel about what we might dial up and what we might dial down. And if you're a 5, not sure, a 5 is okay. Just to bide a little bit more time with you, I personally think I'm probably a 5 or a 6, because I think the more you interview, the more bad habits you actually have. And sometimes going back to basics is what I have to do. So if I prepare for an interview, I really do have to prepare for it. And you know something, negotiating salaries and packages is always a bit kind of, I always get a little bit nervous about doing that. But you know something, I've just learned some hints and tips that get me more comfortable. So Fozia, anything in the chat that's come through?
I'm afraid we haven't got anything in the chat at the moment. But I think I'm the same as you. I haven't had an interview for a long time. I do interviews regularly, but I haven't had one myself. So I'm a little bit in the middle. And again, same with salary negotiation. I'm a little bit tentative about that sort of thing. So Jaden's saying these are 2 for both. So fairly down on the not so comfortable scale there. Anybody else got any comments that they want to add? Thanks, Jaden. That's really helpful.
Yeah, it's good to get an idea. I put myself up as a you'll be pleased to know it's probably as a 7 or an 8 for the preparing interview, but I'm probably down maybe a 3 or 4. So I'm hoping to pick up some tips, Salima, from you today. Negotiating is one of those. Yeah, it is. I think a lot of people do feel a little bit uncomfortable with that. But back over to you, Fozia, for how the guys are feeling about this.
Indeed, yeah, we've got a few more comments coming in. Jaden got them started, so thanks again, Jaden. So we've got a 1. Dhruvesh is 4 and a 7, so not so well prepared for interviews, but much happier doing salary negotiation. And Bhavisha is the same. Oh no, Bhavisha's the opposite, so better prepared for interviews, not so great on salary negotiation. And then we've got a couple 2 and 1 and 5 and 1, so middling for a lot of people.
Yep. Well, that gives us an idea of where you are. And I think as Scott and I talk you through certainly this next session, I hope you walk away with some hints and tips to get you a little bit more comfortable with preparing for interviews or that salary negotiation. What Scott and I will walk through with you, we put together quite comprehensive slides, okay? So afterwards, the Migrant Leaders team can absolutely share these materials with you. So even if you don't have an interview coming up, you can at least use these as a bit of a resource for you, as a bit of a refresher. So, and trust me, we're not going to be going through each of the slides painfully, bullet point by bullet point. We really will be skimming through it, but please use these as a bit of an aide-memoire for yourself. Okay, Scott, over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, so as it says, it starts with the job advert. What do we mean here? So I think one of the things that really gives you as an interviewer really good insight into what's likely to happen in the interview is the job advert. The job advert and the job description are typically broken down into these sorts of 6 components. Generally speaking, you might see some variance, but typically you'd have a job title, where the job's based, some information about the company, what they actually want from you as a potential recruit, the actual job description, what will you be doing on a day-to-day basis, and then usually some additional information. And really this is perfect material to help with the initial preparation of the actual interview. So you've got, and I'm not going to read through all the detail in here, but you've got items here that are going to shed a good light onto what the likely questions are that you're going to get asked. So as a little one, for example, if the job might be based, 50 miles from where you've told the organization as to where you're living, you're likely to get asked a question about your willingness to relocate or your ability to be able to travel to that site. So that's quite a sort of practical component of a question that you may get asked. In terms of where the questions go into a little bit more, typically a bit more depth, are the things that you'll see here on the right hand side. So the qualifications and the job description are where typically a hiring manager will be spending more of their time in terms of understanding what you're about. And like I say, the job description does help with that. One little tip that I'd advise, and it's not watertight, so I wouldn't always advise this. And like Salima said, you ask 1,000 recruiters, you'll get 1,000 different opinions. But typically when you're looking at the qualifications or you're looking at the job description, the things towards the top are more likely to be what's more critical and more important to the hiring manager. It's something to bear in mind. It's not something to always bet your life on, as it were. But typically the things that go towards the top of those lists are likely to be the more critical elements, and the ones that are lower down on those lists are perhaps likely to be, are likely to be still very important, but less critical. So it's just a little tip in terms of preparing and looking at those job descriptions and those qualifications, particularly if the list is quite long. Sometimes the job descriptions, there's a lot that will go in there. So it's just a little tip to help you focus on some of the critical components when you're preparing for that interview. Perfect. Okay, so beyond the actual job ad and the job description, information to really gather before an interview, we've split this into 3 components. You've got the organization, and this is all around the research that you'll be doing. So you've got the organizational research, you've got market research, and then you've got the job research. In terms of the organization, you'll get a lot of this typically from the company website. So the company website should be a treasure trove of information for you. There's no excuse, really, if I'm blunt, to not really know almost everything that's going on the website. Some websites are quite comprehensive, so there'll be a lot of information, but you should have had a very good and really very thorough review of their website, of all the different components of their website in terms of their products, their services, their people, how they describe their organization, and really making sure. But don't be fooled into also thinking that that's enough, because it really is the very minimum that an interviewer would expect you to know. And sometimes people are reassured by knowing everything that's on the website and feeling very confident. But as I say, it really is the bare minimum. And it's really important to also see how does everybody else see this organization, basically, is really how I'd summarize the other critical components. So where do they sit? Who are their competitors? Where do they sit in the market? Depending on the size of organization, you might get more or less information, but there might be for larger organizations, there'll be newspapers articles, there'll be analysts who will share their opinions on these organizations. But even for smaller organizations, you will find information online in terms of who their competitors are and where they sit within, are people feeling very confident about the growth of this organization and about where this organization is going. There are some key websites that I would also always recommend outside of their company website. LinkedIn is absolutely key and critical. You'll always know who you're interviewing with because you need to ask for them when you arrive. And so research that individual online, and also look beyond that individual in terms of who they're connected with, what their background is. How have they been at the company for 6 months, or have they been with the company for 16 years? And those things will tell you, we're jumping to the end a little bit, but if they've been there a very long time, what's kept them there? As a question, or as a talking point that you could, if they've only just joined and they've been there 6 months, what attracted you to the organization? So you create a dialogue, but you're also demonstrating that you've done your research, you've done your homework. They'll be like, oh, that I've only been here 6 months, or people like that. It creates a rapport, and it shows you that you've taken notice, you've listened, you've found stuff out. And then the job research is around the actual skills, and we'll go into this in a little bit more detail. But what is it that they actually want, and what examples are you actually going to use from your CV? What are your strengths and weaknesses in relation to the role? So how are you going to actually sell yourself during that interview? And preparing for that is the third critical component. Okay, anything to add on that, Salima, before we move on? Okay, you're ahead of me, you're moving
Sorry, no,
on.
I would say, I think I would just reiterate what you said. There is no excuse not to prepare. And I know it sounds a lot. In reality, you're probably saying about an hour and a half. That's what you're looking at. You know, you're looking at, I would have liked to have thought if you were applying to an organization, so before this stage, you would have actually already looked on their website, we would have done some of this research. So it's in some ways additive to that particular piece. They are not expecting you to be an expert on the company, because no person actually is, but a little bit of research beforehand goes a really, really long way, whether it's their own website, LinkedIn, YouTube, could be anything at all. That's the critical piece. And the other piece is around, which Scott mentioned, was using the job profile, role profile, to really start thinking about the sort of questions that they may ask you. Believe it or not, recruiters and interviewers do not want to trip you off. They are genuinely trying to find the best candidate for the job. So use the information that is at your disposal. And I think the final piece would be, look at the skills that i.e. what do you need to do, the knowledge, your attitude is about your approach, and the experience. What have you done before? Scott, I think this was my slide, wasn't it? I think. Yeah. Thank you. So let's go back to what the purpose of the interview is. I've just said it is around really understanding the skills, knowledge, and experience an individual has for the role. So the fact that you're being invited for an interview should be quite a boost to your morale and your spirit, because so many people apply for roles and you might have gone through various different other hurdles to get there. So they want to meet you, they want to see you. The meet you might still be electronically. So the purpose of the interview is to really look at two key areas, the seen and the unseen. And I think this is quite important to understand. The seen is around, as I said, your skills, your knowledge and behaviors. This is what you see, what you exude out. It's necessary for top performance, but it isn't sufficient. In an interview, and it might be when they ask you some of those really annoying questions, tell me more. How did you go about doing it? Or if you did it again, what would you do differently? Tell me a little bit more about this particular items. It's the what, why, when, how, and who. What they're trying to get to the bottom of is that unseen. It's the bottom layer of an iceberg. It's about you, your values, your beliefs. Big one about your motivators. What motivates you? What are your drivers and what are your traits? That's what they're really trying to get towards. They try to dig under the surface, as I've said here, underneath the gloss. And there are various different types of interview. There's online interviews, then on-demand interviews, there's technical interviews. So especially if we're going into some kind of engineering or science space, it might be a bit of they give you a technical question and they want to explore with you how you may go about solving it. There are structured interviews, and I would probably say good interviews are always structured in some way, i.e. structured in the sense that they've got a set of questions they want to ask you. There is a bit of leeway, but they really want to ask you some questions that look at the skills, knowledge, and experience that you need. There are portfolio-based interviews, normally roles that are within the media or the arts and other industry, where you bring your portfolio in and they ask you questions about the portfolio. And there are other ones, which is around a case study. The case study can also be a technical one. It could be also for a non-technical, straightforward scenario. What they're really looking for is your ability to think things through also as well. And you may find even within an interview, you have your straightforward questions, which might be, tell me about a time when. There may be some other questions that are, look, in this role, you may be having to face with this challenge. How might you go about doing it? So even within interviews, there may be different types of questions that they're asked, but there are a whole variety of interviews that are out there. Most of them will have a structure to it, will have a question to it. And if it's going to be a technical interview, a scenario or a case study, normally I would like to think the recruiter or the hiring manager will have told you beforehand. So you can't necessarily prepare for it because you don't know what they're going to ask. So you don't come in and you think, well, I thought this was going to be more of a Q&A. Now you're expecting me to think a little bit more around it. And if they don't tell you what kind of interview it's going to be, ask. Great. Back to you, Scott.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you, Salima. So So we're going to try and sort of put ourselves into the shoes of the interviewer, of the line manager. What do they look for? And we've touched on some of these points already, but they're really critical points. And you've got to bear in mind that ultimately the interviewer is wanting somebody, the best person, the right person to fill this job, to make their lives a little bit easier, to move on from recruiting to actually filling the vacancy, having somebody with them, working within their team, and actually contributing to their overall achievements. So what are they actually looking for? Can you do the job? What are your abilities? What are your qualifications? What's some of your experience? What will this person be able to do the job? And how do you fit in to that team dynamic? So some of these components are around, as you can see here in the 4 circles down at the bottom. I quite like the skills. What is it you can do? The knowledge. What do you know? Your attitude, your approach is so important. And then your experience. What is it that you have done? And all of these things are equal. Okay, so depending upon the roles that you're going for, there may be roles whereby you might not have had a lot of experience, for example. That's not an issue, right? That will be deprioritized. If you've been called for an interviewer, the recruiter will know that. And what they're more likely to look at is what's your knowledge, what's the skills, and what's your attitude. So there's kind of a combination here that will determine that. In some scenarios, all 4 will be equally important. In other scenarios, perhaps there'll be something that will come that's more prevalent than the others. And don't underestimate, for example, the importance of your attitude. You can have all the experience in the world, but if you don't have the right attitude and you're not going to fit within that team, then you're very unlikely to be successful in getting that job. And there's a few things here that I just want to shout out. What else does the manager want? And I know this is a lot to think about, but they're also looking for, yes, to do something today, but what would your progression be? And again, this sometimes comes down to your attitude and your knowledge and how you've applied yourself. What's going to be beyond that? A very competent line manager won't just be thinking about filling the job today. They will also be thinking about how can you progress and what's coming next. Are you somebody that could be the succession plan for somebody else within their team, and actually how there'll be a cycle there. So it's something else that is worthwhile having in mind in terms of that. And your attitude often will inform where the manager will think and feel as to how you might fit in and how you might support them in terms of future objectives of that team, particularly around succession and progression. Okay, we've all heard it. How many times has somebody told you first impressions? It's all the time. First impression. You can't go anywhere without that sort of first impressions, and no doubt you're already aware that actually when you meet and what you're saying, that verbal communication, the things that actually come out of mouth, only contribute to about a third, just over a third, of how people are actually sort of taking you in, as it were. 55% is if you like, comes under this visual category, and I'm going to break down in a moment what that specifically means, but it's just always worthwhile just pausing and just remembering that actually that we're complex beings, and there are various components here that always needs to be taken into account. That are outside necessarily the words that will come out your mouth. And we've broken these down into a few parts. So how you look, it is important. Instagram does have a point, right? Only to a point, mind you, but it does have a point. Your body language, your smile, your eye contact, these things matter. If you walk into a room with somebody and you're like this and you're like, we don't do it. Typically, we don't do it. And we're built not to do it because we're social beings, but it's really, really important in that sort of introductory interview scenario, that your body language is positive, you're smiling, your eye contact is good, your handshake is firm. These things, you can dismiss them, but actually they matter, and they really do. They do matter a lot. And you need to consider things like your facial expression, right? If you don't smile, people will notice. You know, I tell my children, smile, the world smiles with you. My youngest used to experiment with this, where she walked down the road and she smiled at people, and they smiled. Guess what? They smiled back, and she was like, "Daddy, it's true. They smiled back at me." I was like, "Wonderful." Right? It's true. You smile, the world smiles back at you. And in this environment, it matters. Your posture, your gestures, they matter. I'm very gestury, as you can see, but that's just the way I am. But it matters how you're slumped in the chair, how you're sat in the chair, how you're upright. People will not necessarily always consciously. Sometimes it's conscious, sometimes it's subconscious. But people will take these things in. I'm talking quite fast at the moment. My pace, I'm kind of conscious of it. I'm slowing myself down. So it matters in terms of your tone. You know, be aware of how you're talking. You know, I'm aware now that I've slowed my tone down because I felt I was going a little bit too fast. And it's just checking in on ourselves. It's hard and it's habits, but these things matter. The words that you say are obviously critical and important. The I and the we. It's really important when you're in an interview situation that you're clearly distinguishing between what you have done and what you have achieved by using the word I. I did this. I achieved that. Right? I went out and introduced I. And there's a space for we as well. You know, you're part of a team, and all of those things are important. But it is important. It's quite easy to talk about the we, and I think people are sometimes a little bit reluctant to talk about the I. In an interview situation, it's really, really important to make sure you're shouting out the I. This is what I did. The positive mental attitude, again, you know, make that attitude component, even if you've not perhaps got all the experience, an interviewer will recognize the positive attitude you've got towards something, and that will, in many instances, that will balance the lack of experience that you might have, and that can often be the difference in terms of the experience or the attitude. Someone with more experience than you but the wrong attitude, and someone with the right attitude and less experience, I know who I'd hire. And that comes down to what I was saying before around line managers and hiring managers are often thinking about filling the job today, but also what the progression is. And I'll come on to this point a little bit later on, but telling a story. And I'm just going to go ... there, and I'll come back to that in a moment.
No, Scott, I would absolutely reiterate that particular piece. Smile. Even if you're doing a telephone interview, smile, because guess what? They may not be able to see your face, but the fact that you're positive and you're smiling will come out in the tone and in your voice, etc. So I'm a big one for that particular piece. The other thing I will, Scott, again, reiterate the point about the positive mental attitude. You will go in and there'll be aspects of the role that you may never have done before. You may not have that exact experience, etc. But going in and, you know, when they ask you questions, you can be upfront about, I don't necessarily have X, Y, and Z experience, but what I do have is this. Because what we're also looking for is people's ability to learn, a willingness and ability. And that's when we talk about attitude. And we're all a work in progress. None of us are our best versions of ourselves every single day. And the ability to learn is so important. I have this mantra that I say to my colleagues and to my children: you have to learn, unlearn, and relearn. Always have that learning mindset. So if there is something that you don't know how to do, you don't know how to do this yet. And by having the right attitude and the propensity and the willingness, you can learn most things in this life. You genuinely can do. Right, Scott, carry on.
Perfect. Okay. So this might be a good practical one for a takeaway. I'm not going to talk through the details here, but this is when you're really sitting down and spending that hour or so, as we said earlier, around preparing. These are these are some of the very practical components in terms of what you're, or how you can actually prepare. So these are the likely questions that you will be asked. It's very, very common for an interviewer to ask you at the beginning of the interview to break the to make you feel a little bit more comfortable and give you an opportunity to talk about something that's fairly easy. Talk me through your experience to date, right? It's not a trick question. It's a very simple question. Some of the things that I would always say here is it's a balance. Is the only trick in this question is you don't want to spend 20 minutes talking you through your experience, and you also don't want to spend 10 seconds. So it's a balance in terms of talking them through. What I always say to people, but again, you ask 1,000 interviewers, recruiters, you'll get 1,000 different answers. I would say about 90 seconds to maybe 2 minutes to be talking through your experience is probably about right. But don't be afraid to say, can I provide you with a little bit more? Is that enough? Have I answered your question? You know, those sorts of things, not specifically to this, but at any point during the interview, if you're sensing that perhaps you've not fully answered the question, then giving yourself that opportunity. And one thing, I know it's not on here right now, but it's just occurred to me as well, is you can say, can I just have a moment? Can I just think of this? And I'll come on to some examples of where perhaps you're most likely to use that opportunity to say that. But there's some really useful things on this slide that will just help you very practically prepare for the interview, and very specific questions here that you're very likely to get asked in an interview. On the right-hand side, you've got some tricky questions, and there are various tricky questions. These are the ones that we all hate being asked, right? What are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? When was the last time you made a mistake? They're typically the most common tricky questions. The answer to this is, in terms of what to do, is prepare, is have something, have a couple of your strengths that are prepared so that you know what you will say, and don't leave these questions don't leave any question to chance. But of all the questions, these are the ones that are, you know, that are in the moment, that are often the ones that are most difficult to answer, and often the ones where your mind just goes blank when you're asked these questions. There's other questions that you'd perhaps feel more confident that you'd answer. I'd still say prepare, don't get me wrong, you prepare for everything. But these ones, you know, like I say, if I ask one of you now, which I'm not going to do, by the way, what are your strengths? Your mind will go blank, most likely. So always prepare for those questions.
Scott, just reinforce what you've said. Most people, you know, when you think about what are your strengths, they go, oh, I don't want to come across as bragging or arrogant. So that's why it's important to think about what they are. 2 to 3 things that are your core strengths. And in terms of your weaknesses, you know, sometimes organizations rephrase those, what are your areas of development? As I've said, we are all a work in progress. So think about what they are. Yeah, you know, for me, it might be sometimes I can be too demanding of people. It can be sometimes I'm very impatient, which I am. If you ask my children, I'm very impatient. But it's around having that self-awareness. What they're really looking for is how self-aware are you, and what are you doing about it? And same with, when was the last time you made a mistake? Or the one I always hate being asked is, can you give me about a time, tell me about a time when you had to resolve a conflict with a colleague? We always, clearly we all work with each other, we're colleagues and we collaborate, but there are times in the world of work where you can actually have a bit of a falling out. It's how you manage the situations that you are in. And I know some of you on the call will be thinking, well, I have very little experience, so what am I going to give? Regardless of what you've been doing, it might be, talk me through some of the decisions that you've made from your GCSEs to your A-levels, or you're to college or going to university. It might be maybe on your CV, you've got some volunteering that you're doing, or something that talks about maybe you were a prefect or doing some charity work, or positions of responsibility at school or university. Those are all really, really valuable material that you'll obviously have those in your CV. And a bit of a plug, I'll be doing CV writing just after this call. So if you're bored, you can join that one. But those are the sort of things that they will be also asking you about when it comes to an interview.
Okay, so I talked a little bit earlier about sort of telling stories, and this I love this technique. And what you'll actually find when hopefully when I'm talking through this is actually you kind of know this or do this anyway, but perhaps haven't come across this specific technique. And it's very powerful. To Salima's point just now around you know, when you're asked those certainly those sort of structured scenario-based questions, you answer them by what's here is the STAR technique. If you're wondering why there's a whole lot of stars at the top of the slide, it's called the STAR technique: situation, task, action, result. We'll come on to self-reflection in a moment, but that's the reason it's STAR. STAR. So and like I say, this you might not have come across this particular technique, but without a doubt, as you tell a story in whatever situation, you're likely to do to follow this sort of pattern. So, and specifically, if we take it into an interview environment and you're asked a question about, you know, tell me about a time when you have whatever it might be, or, you know, a particular scenario or situation or an example of whatever it might be. So the first thing, explain the background. So where were you? What were you doing? Were you were at school? It was whatever year it might have been. So just sort of bookmark, if you like, the background of your example. This is a time when I was in sixth form college, or this was a time when I was out in another country, or whatever it might be. Just put a bookmark in what the situation is, and it just gets people focused on your story. It's the start of your story. It starts to get people tied in. Your task. What is it that you are actually involved in? And, you know, what is it that you actually needed to do? You know, I needed to actually go and meet this person to have a conversation around whatever it might have been. It's about the actual task that you were involved in, and you could bring in here some of the obstacles that you encountered in that situation. So there may have been something, again, part of the story, something that is quite compelling that you can bring people in. The action's very clear. What is it that you actually did? You set out a plan. You went about having the conversation in this particular way. How did you actually address the situation? What was the action that you took? And then well, not quite the final thing, but then what was the result? What actually happened? Did you help resolve the conflict? Did you get two people starting to talk to each other again? Did you achieve a key milestone in a particular project, depending upon the scenario? But everybody has these stories to tell, and like I say, you'll find that typically you tell the story in this sort of way, but possibly not thought about this particular formal technique, which, like I say, is the STAR technique. The final bit of the STAR, or if you want to make it into a stars as opposed to just STAR, is the self-reflection. What was it that you learned? And in an interview scenario, you know, there's always a good opportunity to actually say, you know, I actually made a mistake here. I actually did something that I think I wouldn't quite do the same again. I might change it like this. And this feeds into that critical point that we spoke about earlier around your attitude. And, you know, people like to see it, to get a real insight into that. So how you've learned and what you've done is really important as to how you tell that story and what you've learned from that.
Thanks, Scott. I think the piece of advice I'd add to what you've just said is, once you've looked at the role profile, you've got your CV, you can probably maybe guess some of the questions they may ask you. You can maybe start then thinking about, if I had to, for example, give an example of a time when I had to work in a team. You can think about you can actually then start in your mind, and if it helps, writing down, what's the situation, bullet point, what was the task, what's the action, what was the result? It sort of helps your preparation into, when I tell the story, these are the key points that I want to actually explain to the interviewers that will show a really strong answer to your to the question that's being asked. So always think about it from the star perspective. And Scott, as he said, the S is around that self-reflection. What would you do differently? What did you learn, etc.? Once again, you may not be in the finished article, but do you have the ability to learn, and do you have the ability to reflect upon it going forward?
Okay, superb. Thanks, Salima. So as we come to the end of the interview, typically you'll be asked, have you got any questions? They'll say, right, we're done. I've asked you all my questions. Please, we've got time now for you to ask any questions. I would always recommend that you have a number of questions to ask. Okay, and also don't worry if they've answered some of the questions during the interview. Just be conscious that the fact that they have perhaps answered some of your questions. But there's some really good questions here as examples. You'd obviously be able to find more online, but preparing some questions is really important. Very simply, it shows that you're curious. It shows that you're interested, and these are traits. These are things that anyone that's hiring you is always going to be interested in hearing about and seeing. And there's some really good examples. Everyone has some of their favorites. I particularly like the last couple of questions here. What's the most important thing that I can do to help within my first 90 days? The reason I particularly like that sort of question is because it's making the hiring manager, the person that's interviewing you, think about you actually physically there doing the job in that environment. So I feel that question almost has almost a psychological moment to you're dragging yourself into actually being there. So that's always a good question. What does success look like? What would you say after 6 months, after 9 months, after 12 months you would expect me to achieve? So those are some of my favorites. But as I said, there's some good questions here, and they will sometimes answer some of your questions along the way. So having more questions as opposed to less is better. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for having questions. It's very, very disheartening for an interviewer to get to the end of an interview and to be said, I've got no questions for you. It's like, even if you've done a brilliant interview, the interviewer will kind of go, oh. It doesn't mean you're not going to get the job. Don't get me wrong, okay? But it's kind of that they want to be asked questions, and I think it's important that you have some questions to ask. We've got some tips on the right-hand side here. Don't be late. We talked about that never be late. Just don't be late. Get up an early train. Get an earlier train. Get up earlier. Just never be late. If you are, call them. Explain what's going on. There are obviously sometimes circumstances that will make you late. If you're in that situation, call, email, message, WhatsApp, anything and everything that you can do to try and explain that situation if you do end up in that situation. We talked about that visual component, smile, handshake. Test the technology. If you're online, if you're doing Teams or you're doing a Zoom, just test it with a friend, send the link, just make sure that it's working on your laptop or on your phone or however you're connecting. As we said, talk about you, don't fall into that we thing. It's make sure you're talking about I. Be really honest and say thanks. Everyone likes to be thanked. Say thanks at the end of the interview. Thanks for considering me. Thanks for your time. I look forward to hearing from you. You can also ask, when can I expect to hear from you? There's nothing wrong with asking, when can I expect to hear from you? What's going to happen? What can I expect to happen next? You can ask those questions. There's no harm in asking those questions. It shows you're keen. It shows you're interested. Yeah, they're good, positive questions to ask your interviewer. Salima.
No, I think that's exactly it. Basically, always come with 2 to 3 questions. If they have already answered the questions, you can say things like, thank you very much. In your introduction, you talked about X, Y, and Z. Can you elaborate a little bit more of that? So, yep, it's the same question you were going to ask, but it allows them to open that up a little bit more. So always have the questions and the interview tips. Yep, agreed. Always go in with that mindset of being your best, being ready, We run through lots of hints and tips also as well. Thank you, the interviewer. It sounds like a really, really basic thing, but it's around, in some ways, good manners also as well. Thank you very much for their time. Little things like that will put you positively, positive memory of you, especially when they're interviewing candidates back to back. And that's really quite hard when you are interviewing people back to back. Which candidate was that? Which candidate was that? So leaving a positive impression.
100%. Okay, and then afterwards, you've left the interview, you've gone home, you're on the train. The self-reflection is really important. You know, there's always something to learn from being in these interview scenarios. You know, even if you don't get the job, but almost especially if you don't get the job, you could argue that sometimes there's even more to learn if you haven't got the job. But it's a positive experience. But reviewing what it was you did well, what you felt that you needed to improve on, you know, knowing these things, documenting these things, being able to learn from these things so that when you go in to your next interview, you can actually take advantage of what you've actually achieved and what you've learned from that first interview. You know, again, it's that positive attitude. Okay, you may not succeed. You won't succeed in every interview. No one ever has. It doesn't happen. So, but there's going to be something that you can learn, something that you can take away, something that will be positive as a result of that experience, and something that you can use in order to actually help you next time. And don't be afraid. You know, unfortunately, not all recruiters, not all line managers provide great feedback. Okay, be bold in terms of asking for feedback. As I say, one of the questions at the end, you know, when can I expect to hear? You know, it's an important question to ask because you can then hold to account, and it gives you more credibility if you're following up to say, you know, I was told that I would hear by Friday. It's now Friday, or it's now Monday. I haven't heard anything. Please, can you let me know what's going on? So, you know, it's a positive thing in terms of asking for that. And if they say, sorry, you've not been successful, don't leave it there. You know, push for feedback. You know, feedback is important in the environment and the world that we live in. Managers are told over and over again that they need to be providing feedback, and you reiterating that by pushing them, by asking that question, you know, hopefully you will be successful in actually receiving some feedback that will help you build. So be confident in terms of pushing. You've given your time. Yes, they've given their time as well, but your time is valuable. And there's nothing wrong with making that point. I really enjoyed the interview. I enjoyed spending time. I appreciate that I've not been successful, but I really, you know, I invested in this. I was keen on this. Please tell me, please give me some feedback. It's really important to me. Be confident in terms of doing that, and then move on. Take that feedback, take it on board, and then move on to your next opportunity.
Scott, before we move on, because what we'll do, we'll stop for a break of questions. I'm just conscious we've been talking. One of the things I love about this photo is in the back, you can actually see in the red, yellow and green writing, I was, I am, I will. And I think that's just a nice spirit to think about. I was, what I've done in the past, I am, here today, and I will, is how you will progress as an individual, etc. So that's a good piece always to remember. So I'm going to stop sharing now. I'd like to sort of open it up to your questions. I do have a few more slides to go through, but I think it'd be quite good just to maybe hear from others. And there's lots of questions I can see. Question: if we come across a question in an interview which we totally do not have an answer for, is it fine to say I don't know the answer to this question? Shall I go first? No. Have a try. So what you can do, a couple of things is, there will be questions that you see they're going, what are they asking me? Your brain might have had the brain fog. It could be anything. The nerves might have gotten to you. I actually think what you should say is, oh, take a moment and say, I think I have an example. So maybe I can start sharing the example, and you can maybe tell me if it doesn't quite hit the mark. So I would at least try and give it a go, but having a mental break which can feel like a lifetime when you're in an interview, you think, oh, why is it so quiet? Oh, I'm thinking about it. And then at least attempting to answer it. Scott and Fosa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think exactly as Salima was saying, I think finding a scenario, talking around something, you know, in terms of a specific experience, there's always something that you can reflect on as part of an answer to that particular question. So I would 100% agree with Salima that no, it's not fine to just say, I don't know. I think there's always an opportunity, and yes, it might be challenging. Yes, you might need to take that. Can I have a moment just to think about this? But there's something, and that you'll be surprised in yourself as to something that you will start talking about that you feel can then leads to a more legitimate answer to the question, and a part answer to the question is better than saying, I don't know.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say, it's always worth possibly asking if you understand the question correctly, or asking for clarification of the question, and also just to take a moment to think about it. And actually, people have said to me in the past when I've been interviewing them, could I have some time to think about that? Could we come back to that question? So there are ways of managing that if you can't think on your feet.
So that's a really important point. Sometimes interviewers will actually ask you 3 questions in one. And you're going, and you're going, okay, where's the question? And I know my brain goes blank. And I think, Fosa, that's a really good point around, could you just clarify the question again? Or could you maybe rephrase that? Or can you have a little bit more time just to think about it? One of the things that I do is I know it sounds old fashioned. I have a copy of my CV I always take with it. And you guys will laugh at this. This is my CV here. I actually have a CV on my desk. So when I go for interviews, I should take a copy of my CV with me. It is a bit of a comfort blanket for me, don't get me wrong. If I have a brain fog, I can look down, I can have a look at it and go, oh, that's what the example was. There's a couple of questions I do want to talk about, which is around, is it okay to ask about negotiate salary in the interview itself? My personal preference is you leave salary negotiations outside of the interview. That would be my view. Normally, the interviewer or the recruiter will be asking you for that information, you know, offline. You also need time and space to think about what the offer is, etc., etc. It's not something that I would be comfortable in doing, because bearing in mind, it's also a bit, you know, well, you haven't got the job yet, so let's secure the job first, and then you can do the negotiate the salary. There's another question I want to talk also about, because it's about the salary as well. Is it okay to negotiate a lower salary for a starting job if there is a skill that you need to acquire or learn? If they offer you a salary that you feel is competitive and you've done your research, etc., then my view would be, why would you negotiate a lower salary? If that's the salary that they want to give you, and unfortunately today we're not going to be able to run through my couple of slides because we're running out of it, but in my slides, which you'll get afterwards, it does talk about doing your research, preparing. There's so much resources out there for individuals now, having a look at what's available. You also need to think about the opportunity. For the opportunity it is, what are you going to learn? It's not all about the money. The money is important, do not get me wrong, but think about the benefits, think about the culture, think about what you're going to learn, think about what you're going to learn from the organization, the team. Think of it as a holistically whole package, especially when you're early in your career. Early in your career, that's what's going to give you the leapfrog to go on to, in some ways, bigger or better roles. And actually, if they do offer you a salary, it's completely fair to ask, you know, what's the benchmark data, what's the range, etc. They may not tell you the answer. They may just say the salary is competitive. That's probably what I would say. But as I said, there's so much research out there that can give you an indication of, well, this role would pay between 25,000 and 35,000. I'm just making those numbers up, depending on the role, give you a feel for where they are pitching you against that particular piece. Scott, maybe there's the question you can also help answer now. It's around how do you demonstrate the knowledge that you've acquired about a company when you're researching it without coming across as being too arrogant. So how do you weave that research that you've done into maybe some of the answers that you give?
Yeah, I think I like that question. So I think that through the questions, that there's a couple of ways that I'd suggest. So one way is through the questions that you are asked. You should be able to find ways to demonstrate some of that knowledge. So if you're asked a question around, obviously the obvious ones are if you ask the question specifically around the company, then you can start talking very easily. But if you're asked questions a little bit more about your knowledge or your experience, there is nothing wrong with actually saying, when I was, this is some of my knowledge and some of my experience, and when I was actually researching and looking at your organization, these are the things that I found really interesting, and these are some of the reasons as to why I applied. So tying that into some of your answers, is possible. I think if you haven't had that opportunity, then actually, and you get towards the end of the interview, then actually asking a question about something that you've read into or that you've learned, is again a really nice way to actually demonstrate. I watched this video on YouTube about your CEO talking at a conference last year in San Francisco, and he said X, Y, and Z. How's that gone? He talked about a strategy. Maybe it's an old video, it's 12, 18 months old. What's happened today? I heard him talk around that. So I think there are questions that you can also ask if you feel that actually you want to demonstrate that knowledge. You've got to the end of the interview, you perhaps haven't had an opportunity to demonstrate that knowledge. You can actually build it in through your questions in terms of demonstrating that without coming across as arrogant. Nice question, Jaden.
That's a very, very good question. Exactly. Fosie, I think we're running out of time. So I'll just say, as I said before, there's 3 or 4 slides that we were going to talk a little bit more about sort of negotiating the salary. You will get that in the pack. And Fosie, we always end up rushing the end bit. So maybe next year we need to have a specific one that talks about negotiating a great salary.
I apologize as well. Maybe
no, Scott, you're fine. It's a valuable piece. So thank you, Fosie.
Thank you.
Well, I should just say thank you very much to both of you for sharing your experience and your knowledge with all of us. I think it's been really helpful. And I would just say, Scott, I loved your additional S at the end of the star. It's something that I talk to the students about when I interview them. And you're the first person that's validated my thinking on that. So thank you for that.
All credit goes to Salima.
Thanks, Scott. It's teamwork. Remember, teamwork makes the dream work.
I'll take that. Hug. Teamwork.
I encourage our students to actually keep a matrix, so type up their thoughts for their star questions so that they've got that, they can refresh their memory before they go to an interview. That's often worth doing as well.